Hi, thank you very much for coming to this wonderful special event hosted by Center for International Studies, CIS. I am the director of CIS, which is sponsoring this program. So it's my greatest pleasure to celebrate the book, International Human Rights Survey, which just came out from Cambridge University Press in 2023. We have the wonderful honor to have the two authors here and also a discussant. So let me introduce them first and then talk a little bit about the kind of flow of this event. So two authors here are Dr. Cher Weixia Chen in front of us. He is associate professor in the School of Interpretive Studies at George Mason University. And I'm really thrilled to mention that she is actually our PhD student who graduated in 2009. So this is the Political Science and International Relations program at USC. At George Mason, she also is the founder of the Human Rights and Global Justice Initiative. She is a senior scholar of the Center of the Advancement of Wellbeing, as well as the faculty fellow of Institute for Sustainable Earth. Her scholarship focuses on women's rights, indigenous rights, international comparative legal studies. Along next to Cher is Dr. Alison Renteln, who probably does not need any introduction to this crowd, but let me do that regardless. So she's a professor of political science and anthropology at the University of Southern California. She teaches law and public policy with an emphasis on international law, human rights, comparative legal systems, constitutional law, and legal and political theory. She is an expert on cultural rights, and including the use of cultural defense in the legal system. She served as the State Bar Commission on Access to Justice and the California Judicial Council and Fairness Advisory Committee. And she has also served as a member of the California Attorney General's Commission on Hate Crimes. We are also privileged to have wonderful discussant online here in front of you. She is Dr. Misha Gilman. She is a professor of political science and anthropology. She's an associate professor of the political science in the Marble Institute of Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies at Emerson College. She's the director of the Emerson Prison Initiative. Her research spans human rights, democratization, education policies across the globe, as well as she's the current president of Human Rights Section of American Political Science Association, APSA. She is a founding member of Expert Witness Section of the LASA, Latin American Studies Association, too. She's the author of the Misrepresentation and Silence in the United States History of Textbooks, the Politics of Historical Oblivion from Palgrave, forthcoming in this coming year. So just the flow of the things is as follows. We would like to have Dr. Chen talk about the outline of this wonderful book. By the way, this is it. Wonderful book in the first 20 minutes, and followed by Dr. Renteln to discuss it furthermore. And then we would like to give the floor to Dr. Gilman for the discussion. I hope we have time for Q&A. Those who are attending online, I'll be monitoring your questions online. And hopefully we will have time to address them at the end of these three interventions. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the presentation first. Thank you.
Thank you, Sari. Thank you, Matt and Linda, for making this trip possible. Can you all hear me all right? Yes. and returning to USC and Los Angeles, a place I call second hometown, is truly incredibly heartwarming. So thank you for everything, and thank you for inviting me. This year marked the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and publishing this book in many ways is our tribute to this monumental document. And for many of us, human rights scholars and educators, UDHR is truly akin to our Bible. So please allow me to walk you through the journey of writing this book. So Alison and I, we saw an amazing increase of those human rights and social justice related studies, coupled with the development of those international and also interdisciplinary human rights program in our own country and also across the globe. And all of this pointed to a growing demand of interdisciplinary, holistic textbook catering to the introductory courses in those interdisciplinary human rights programs. Also, I know there are a number of human rights textbooks on the market, and I believe I have read most of them, all of them, and they are heavily legalistic. So it's our wild dream to coming up with an interdisciplinary textbook that will somewhat, transform human rights education. So these are some of the intellectual or pedagogical thinking behind writing this book. But I have to say, ultimately, writing this book is deeply personal because years after years, Alison and I, we both encountered challenges of sourcing a fitting interdisciplinary textbook to our own human rights courses. So we developed those courses, we are teaching those courses, but we found difficulty of using a fitting textbook for those courses. So coupled with this years of accumulated teaching insights spurred the idea of crafting our own textbook. And why not? So I approached Alison with this wild idea of writing this book. And by the way, I owe everything to you, Alison. And she said yes, and this response essentially set our journey, or I have to say, adventure together in motion. And the result is this book. And this journey has been profoundly challenging, spending several years and marked by the global pandemic and also the internal transition at the university, Cambridge University Press. We have worked with 5 different editors. But every challenge has brought its own reward in some way. In the end, both of us, we are just incredibly grateful to see our book receiving positive reviews and endorsements from different countries and resonating with both academic and practitioners alike. As you can see, this is a brief summary of the endorsement we have received so far. In fact, I think 2 weeks ago, I had this privilege of meeting Mr. Alison. He was the former Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada. He has served the organization for over 20 years. And before our first in-person meeting, he emailed me saying in the email that in fact this is a very small world. And he has been using this book in 3 international human rights courses he was teaching, 2 at University of Ottawa, 1 at the Housing University. And this semester I serve as a Fulbright scholar with University of Ottawa, so I had this opportunity to meet him, practitioner. So he said, in fact, this would be very much a pleasure to make a personal connection. And as you know, as an author, knowing somebody not just reads your book, but values and integrates the content of your book into the curriculum is just one of the most rewarding feedback you can receive. So I'm truly grateful. And So now back to our book. Here are some of the features of this book, and we call it the 3I's, a little bit cheesy, but just to, summarize some of the distinctive aspects of this book. The first I is this book provides an interdisciplinary survey of global human rights challenges. As you can see from each chapter, we not only use law review articles, we heavily use social science and humanities materials. And in this chapter, chapter 8, environmental protection and human rights. So we started with the introduction of international environmental rights movement, and we move on to international environmental law as it relates to human rights. We also discuss the theory and practice about environmental protection and human rights. There are like 4 theoretical approaches. And then we focus on environmental justice, its movement, theory, and issues with a special focus on environmental racism. And we spent a lot of time discussing those environmental issues as they relate to human rights, including pollution and human rights, climate change and human rights, and environmental refugees and human rights. We wrap up the chapter with a case decided by Inter-American Court of Human Rights in 2020, indigenous community members of DACA versus Argentina. So, and if you read the reference for this chapter, you will realize how diverse the sources are. In fact, I actually consulted my colleagues from environmental studies and biology for this chapter, and they are so helpful. They pointed me to some very important literature and scholars covered in this chapter. And for each chapter, we try really hard to use scholars from different fields and to highlight their voice and their scholarship. The second I is that we provide an international coverage of those issues, particularly focusing on the global south. And the idea is that every issue actually they have their own implication for different regions, right? So, for example, for this chapter, LGBTQ rights, we started with the introduction, then we talk about gay rights, queer movement, LGBTQ plus, queer studies, and queer theory. And then we move on to concepts of LGBTQ rights as human rights and the terminologies associated with LGBTQ rights. And we specifically discuss the status of LGBTQ rights under human rights law at the UN level in Europe and in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia Pacific, in Middle East. As you can see, we try really hard to cover every region we can find materials of for each substantive human rights. And we wrap up the chapter with a very important or landmark case decided by Taiwan Constitutional Court on same-sex marriage, the JY interpretation number 748. And the idea is that for a lot of current human rights textbook on the market, they sometimes just focus on one region, and so we try to cover the vast areas, and then to highlight the relevance of human rights issues. The other feature of this book is the in-depth exploration of those understudied human rights topics. Don't get me wrong, we certainly cover those traditional human rights topics, right? So the philosophical foundation of human rights, different approaches, different perspective of human rights, and also the challenges of identifying what constitutes as human rights abuses, and also human rights mechanisms, the UN level, the regional level, and the domestic level, right? And we also cover a variety of substantive human rights topics, like those hardcore human rights issues, genocide, torture, capital punishment, and other cruel and unusual form of punishment. Our book is unique in the sense that it covers those understudied human rights topics like socioeconomic rights, cultural rights, environmental rights. And we also cover the rights of marginalized groups, including women's rights, children's rights, rights of persons with disabilities, indigenous rights, labor rights, and LGBTQ plus rights. And I found my students, they are fascinated by those the rights of marginalized groups, and they found them relevant to their daily life in a way. And so we put them all together in one book, and I'm very proud of, how we can consolidate a lot of important and emerging human rights topics in one book, and just for the convenience of our readers. So as you can see from this chapter 13 on women's rights, for each particular group's rights, we started with a survey of the sufferings of this particular group, in this case, the sufferings, the status of women around the world. Then we move on to the social movements associated with that particular group, in this case, transnational feminist movement. And then we certainly need to provide the concepts and theories associated with this group. So in this case, we have private versus public sphere, gender equality versus gender equity, and the ever increasingly important analytical tool intersectionality. And then we also talk about women's rights and the human rights law at the UN level, also at the regional level. And those topics, including the conventional women's rights topic, right, like violence against women, but we also cover other topics, including women's socioeconomic and cultural rights. And then we highlighted a very important case and also interesting case, AS versus France, decided by European Court of Human Rights on face covering. So for this chapter, actually, I was very glad to receive an email from Professor Bernard Wood, the editor of Human Rights Quarterly. And in his email, he said he was preparing a chapter, a lecture for the Human Rights program at the University of at the China University of Political Science and Law in Beijing on women's rights, and he said he found this chapter to be very helpful. So that was truly gratifying to me. And so these are some kind of three distinctive features I would like to highlight for our book. In addition, in our book, we also address some of the pedagogical challenges we have encountered over the years. So one challenge we often receive is like in the students, they complain they just don't see the daily relevance of human rights. So we provided an online resources for the instructors. They include class activities, discussion prompts, and simulations. We also provide a media highlight for each chapter, and the potential discussion questions, so documentary or movie. And the idea is to make the human rights courses more engaging and interactive. Students, they also complain, they just don't like theories because they struggle to understand the theories. So we...
Not at USC.
Definitely not USC. Definitely not USC, yeah. So we provided the definition of those key concepts at the outset of each chapter, so to help students gain some clarity without wading through those dry, difficult, obnoxious vocabularies. And also we tried very hard to make the content of this book interdisciplinary, because my own human rights courses at George Mason, students are from different backgrounds. So the idea is to make the content accessible to the students from diverse educational backgrounds. So I often have this dream, kind of unrealistic dream, but it doesn't hurt to have a dream of expanding the human rights community. I'm hoping it could reach not just human rights law students, but every college student. So this is one small way to help making my dream come true a little bit, or getting closer to that kind of dream. And the last one I would like to address is the gap between human rights theory and human rights practice. So we provide a list of NGOs, a kind of directory of NGOs at each chapter for their particular human rights cause. And so students, they can use this, and instructors can use this as a helpful resource to help students, locate the possible volunteer opportunities, internship opportunities, or employment opportunities in that particular human rights area they're interested in. So it's an idea to bridge the gap between theory and practice. And so this is about our book. As we are contemplating a second edition, we are thinking about adding some chapters, so your feedback will be extremely valuable as it will guide our revisions and reforms for the next one. So thank you. And I will stop here and pass the floor to Alison. Alison has much more important insights to share with you.
Dr. Chen, that was so thorough, no one will need to read the book now. So thank you very much to Dornsife, the Center for International Studies, Dr. Katada, Dr. Matt Stevens, Linda Kim. It was a lot of work to put this together in a relatively short time. Most of all, thanks to Dr. Cher, who is here for one day from the University of Ottawa, where she has a distinguished research chair in global justice and human rights. So thank you for making the trek last night from Toronto. We'd also like to express our gratitude to Cambridge University Press and our many editors for publishing this volume. We're grateful also to Professor Manisha Gelman for offering reflections on our book. We'd also like to thank Ivy Sue, who designed the cover. I believe she's a relative of Cher's. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that she's your daughter, but there you go. I thought she did a wonderful job with the cover design. Thanks to all of you for making time to come help us celebrate this book. Many of you here provided inspiration for this project, and you certainly provided moral support. So this has been many years in the works, this project. So I'd like to say a few words about why human rights are important, what our book contributes, and what topics we might want to consider in the future. So the idea of human rights is very important, and the tragedies going on in the world today, I think, show the necessity of having human rights standards. It's a powerful notion, the idea that we want to try to alleviate the suffering of people across the globe. Human rights are for everyone. All human beings are entitled to human rights, regardless of race, gender, age, disability. Doesn't matter if they're documented or if they're incarcerated. Everyone is entitled to basic human rights. Human rights also matter because they apply in peacetime and in wartime. We can talk about the Geneva Conventions and the Common Article 3 in protecting civilians from being targeted, but human rights apply always in peacetime and in wartime. Human rights are significant because they require enforcement. A human right has a correlative duty on the part of some other agent to to enforce those rights. Typically, we think of states as bearing that responsibility, but increasingly we've come to recognize that corporations, foundations, universities, private agents, and other non-state actors also bear responsibility for the protection of human rights. And I think in the 21st century, we believe that there should be no bystanders, that we're all complicit in human rights violations if we don't take action. There can be no bystanders in the 21st century. So we hope that our book contributes in some way to the human rights movement. As you've heard, it provides a broad overview of topics, a wide array of topics. Some of them are the more standard topics like the atrocities, genocide, and torture. We also made an effort to cover enforcement mechanisms at every level of government. So international tribunals, national governments, regional human rights institutions, and cities. All different levels of government have a duty to protect human rights. So that in the enforcement chapter, we emphasize that. I think it's really important to think about who has a duty to protect human rights, because states have this dual role. States are expected to protect human rights, but it's usually states that are the ones violating human rights. So tragically, many of the most egregious human rights violations are state-sponsored, occur under color of law. Our book also looks at what I call the hierarchy problem, the tension between different sets of human rights. So there's a tendency in the human rights movement for people to focus on one type of human right without looking at the interrelationship between, for example, women's rights and religious freedom, or privacy rights and the right to health. So there are a lot of tensions between and among human rights, the right to development and the right to environment. So we try in the book to help students grapple with the relative importance, this issue of ranking different kinds of human rights. And as Dr. Chen, I think, explained, we've tried to cover topics that are largely ignored in other books. So persons with disabilities. I can't think of any human rights book that has a chapter on disability rights, even though that was the first human rights treaty to be adopted in the 21st century. We look at children's rights, which oddly are also ignored. And recently I was in a meeting with a colleague who acknowledged that even though he'd written a human rights text, it didn't deal with women's rights, and he wasn't even sure he had cited female scholars, female colleagues. So we're really making an effort to be inclusive, to include scholarship by people, not only in different fields, but also in different languages. And Dr. Chen didn't mention, but she's fluent in many different languages. She writes beautifully and speaks beautifully, although she's still a little soft-spoken. I've been trying to get her to speak louder since I've Of course, who am I to speak? I'm the one who needs the microphone, right? So, but anyway, we've made an effort to try to deal with different kinds of human rights topics that have been overlooked. And one of the reasons I was so excited to work with her was that she has this amazing language ability. And some of the doctoral students here in the program helped me by reading human rights sources in other languages. We wanted to make sure that we didn't miss important scholarship. I'm sure we've missed things, and we would welcome your suggestions, but it's not only things in English that should be cited in the field of human rights. We deal with the question of cultural relativism, the challenge it poses to universal human rights, and we argue that it's possible to do empirical work to identify shared values, or what we call cross-cultural universals. So we don't shy away from these difficult theoretical issues. And we also deal with new theories that challenge human rights, like THWAIL, Third World Approaches to International Law. So I think students enjoy having a chance to grapple with difficult theories, and certainly the students at USC enjoy these, what you call obnoxious problems. We try to highlight successes where human rights standards have empowered people. It shouldn't always be a depressing story. Obviously, we need to do better with the enforcement of human rights, but our book does try to include in each chapter at least a few selected examples of success. So we're hoping that our book contributes to those instructors who want to start teaching human rights in other departments, because really lawyers have dominated the discourse and the conversation about human rights, and really other fields in the social sciences, medical schools, public health schools, business schools, should be offering courses in business and human rights, health and human rights. So we're hoping that the book will help other people see that they can use our book to maybe start new kinds of courses. You will notice also that we wrote each chapter as a sort of separate entity so that the references are at the end of each chapter rather than at the end of the book. Because some people may choose not to assign the whole book, but we're hoping at least if they have a book and but it doesn't cover disability rights or labor rights ought to be part of human rights too, that they can at least use the chapter of the book. So we're hoping that it opens up the field in a certain way. And we were very conscious of designing the book in a way that it would be able to be used by people who had different needs for different topics. So what about the future edition? If and when we get to do the next edition, I think we've scheduled in November to speak to our 5th editor about what might go into the next edition. We think that health, which is covered, the right to health as a human is covered in the chapter on economic and social cultural rights, but I think we realize that it needs its own chapter. I think technology has changed the way our world functions. So what is the role of artificial intelligence? What about facial recognition? It seems to me we'll probably need to have a chapter that deals with some of these types of questions. And we've been advised and we agree that international financial institutions are increasingly playing a role in following up on human rights changes and environmental policy changes. And so I think that's something that we need to add. So we would welcome your suggestions about topics or cases or other things that ought to be added. It's our hope that this book will attract more people to the human rights movement. The goal is to make human rights violations unthinkable. We have good laws, we have pretty good institutions, but we need to change the way people think. And human rights education is part of that social movement to change how people think about human rights. So I just want to end by thanking everybody here who helped us along the way. And for those of you who are going to join the movement, we want to thank you for your ideas, your inspiration, and your moral support. And again, I want to thank Dr. Cher, Chen, and the many other students I've had a chance to work with over my 36 years at USC. I've learned so much from you, and it's really exhilarating to be here today. So thank you so much for giving us this chance.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Chen and Dr. Renteln. And now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Gelman on the screen, please.
Hello, everyone. Is the sound okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, first off, I want to add my congratulations to Drs. Chen and Renteln for the completion of this volume. They said, you saw on the slide, that it was called a tour de force by one of the endorsers, and it truly is that. Many of us academics feel a sense of accomplishment and perhaps a sense of closure when our book projects turn into physical things that we can hold in our hands. With the publication of this book, I hope that the authors feel not just a sense of accomplishment, but they have really made a major contribution to the legacy of human rights as a field of study through this sophisticated, comprehensive, and at the same time, very approachable volume, which has a place in classrooms for many years to come. I'd like to use my discussant privilege for 3 purposes today in the short time that I'm with you. First, I want to offer some personal reflections on the impact of this book through the lens of my own career. Second, in disciplinary fashion, I'll offer a few small critiques that could perhaps inform the subsequent edition that it sounds like the authors will soon be discussing. And third, and finally, I'll offer a few reflections on the future of human rights as a field and this book's place in it. To begin, when I opened this book and my eyes worked their way down the table of contents, it felt like reading the themes of my own life's work. From cutting my teeth on anti-redwood logging activism in high school, part of far Northern California's environmental rights movement, to my decades of research on comparative Indigenous and minority cultural rights, to the work I'm doing now directing the Emerson Prison Initiative, which is a college and prison program, I felt like I was seeing so many of the themes of my own work reflected in this succinct and summarized way, all in one place, when often they feel spread out across so many different spaces. As I dove into the text, all 590 pages of it, which I've read over the last 2 weeks in preparation for today's event, I saw an ordered roadmap to what often feels like an insurmountably messy compilation of issues. Doctors Chen and Renteln have taken the totality of human suffering and parsed it such that it becomes navigable, studyable, if you will, and hopefully solvable, something that we can successfully design interventions to address. One of my personal epiphanies during the reading was that though I've often described myself as a political scientist who studies human rights, in fact, it might be more accurate to rephrase this as being a human rights scholar who uses the tools of political science to address the issues, the fullness of human rights as its own category of study, and the interdisciplinary ways in which scholars from across the social sciences and humanities can engage in human rights work is beautifully on display in this volume. Centering this field, as Doctors Chen and Renteln do, gives students an entry point to a wealth of knowledge, and experts a way to see the linkages across issues that are sometimes presented in isolated ways. For me, this book provides a mirror, a space of reflection to pause and see the ties that bind across the many issues that haunt me, even as I try to write my way toward their solutions. So as I shift away from the personal, I'll go off script and say, there was really sort of a life flashing before my eyes moment in getting to move through this book and seeing the gathering of so many disparate spaces into one space. It's like I've reviewed a lot of human rights books, but I think it is what Dr. Renteln just mentioned, the inclusion of these perspectives that are so often kept out, right? When Dr. Chen talked about the women's rights section, that there's just insufficient attention to these issues in other texts, and their inclusion here shows that they really can be successfully woven together into core textbooks. Now I'll turn my disciplinary tradition of discussant as critic and offer just a few small observations of things that could be addressed in future editions. And I certainly hope there will be a subsequent edition. And these criticisms are not at all as critique, but rather to look at as we continue to iteratively improve how we talk about human rights, just a few very small points. So one of the things that stood out at me, and I think this happens to many of us as we write, is that citations fall out of date, right? So in a subsequent edition, how can we bring updated information? And there were a couple places where this stuck out. I think in the coverage of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, there could be a space to update that particular reference point. And similarly, in the chapter on children's rights, which I was delighted to see included in this volume, and it was really quite comprehensive, also a more recent citation on the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict would address some of the newer developments in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So again, very small points, but ones that I think in subsequent editions could be impactful. I do have one personal quibble and mostly address it, but the term female genital mutilation is obviously highly politicized. And in the very first chapter of the book, you do an excellent job addressing the many forms that this terminology takes and some of the ethical and relativist issues that come up when people select the term. But then there's later, I think it's in one of the final chapters of the book, where the term female genital mutilation rather than circumcision is used, and it renders judgment in a way that I would perhaps urge revision of in a subsequent edition. This draws on a topic that I teach regularly, so I know that I have heightened sensitivity to it because it's a case study that I use year after year. And I think that revision at the end of the book in a subsequent edition would be helpful. But again, you address the terminology in ways that are much more in-depth and sensitive than I've seen in many other texts in the very first chapter, and I really commend you for that. And since Dr. Renteln was mentioning potential additional themes for subsequent edition, I would also just make a plug for immigration there, because you have in the index, there's multiple entries for migrant workers, which are a big part of the story when we look at certainly human rights abuses. But I think that migration itself could perhaps could warrant an additional chapter. These are very small quibbles in an enormous volume that is so comprehensive and masterful that the majority of my time reading was spent thinking how I could adopt the text for my classes, whether in sections or in case studies. And I love the references at the end of the chapters, because I was thinking perhaps I would start by bringing in a couple of the chapters, including the indigenous peoples chapter, which is, I think, really a highlight of the volume and so sensitively done. So I'll turn to the third and final set of comments about the field of human rights itself. I suspect that I was invited to serve as discussant today because of my current role as president of the Human Rights section for the American Political Science Association. And after presiding as division co-chair during the lead up to APSA 2023, which was complicated because of the labor strike in Los Angeles, as some of you may very well know, I had a front row seat to the topics that fellow human rights scholars are working on as I was adjudicating which proposed conference papers would be accepted and which would not. To be frank, I see human rights as a rather divided field at the moment. On the one hand, there are institutionalists who analyze the way that systems of states, as well as an array of transnational actors, address human rights issues. These scholars are working at the state and international level, system level of analysis. On the other hand, are those working at the individual and community level, particularly visible in the work of political ethnographers and those who walk the very fine line between human rights activism and scholarship. These two worlds of scholarship significantly overlap, but they're often in tension with each other. And that tension was really palpable in that space of APSA paper proposals, trying to create panels that had something in common with each other. One of the things I most appreciate about the volume that we're celebrating today together is the way that it accommodates both fields of human rights scholarship. The authors provide rich, detailed analysis of the systems and structures that shape human rights work. And at the same time, they include numerous examples of court cases that show the ways individuals and communities interact with those structures. Bridging the gap that exists in the human rights field is not a small task. And as I finished reading the book, I felt like I better understood both the machinery of human rights, if you will, those structures and systems, and also the people driving the machines. Such a combination offers concrete lessons for today's students looking for human rights primers that can orient them in the field in the course of a semester, and also for those of us looking to try to integrate these very fractured elements of the field into a comprehensive story that can be compelling, whether to students or to policymakers or in other spaces where we make our interventions. To close, I again offer my heartfelt congratulations to Drs. Chen and Renteln for their massive labor and expertise in crafting this book. And I also thank them for giving me a few weeks to be a student again, curled up with my nose in a book, something that I very rarely get to do at this stage in my career, but it's really one of my favorite parts of being an academic. And reading a book that spoke to me on so many ways, as this one does, was truly a pleasure. My takeaway message for myself, my students, and anyone else willing to listen, meaning those of you in the room, is that ultimately we can best intervene and address the human rights violations happening in the world all around us when we better understand the history, context, cultural frameworks, and ethical dilemmas at play. This book furthers that understanding, and I thank you for writing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. German, for a wonderful intervention and discussion. I would like to open the floor to Q&A. I also would like to open that to the people in the Zoom. You really don't show, but there are more than a few dozens of people attending online. If I'll let you start from the floor too, but please identify yourself before you ask your question. No, don't be shy. Yeah, okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Saran, second year PhD student at USC. Bit of a plant in the audience, I must say. It's no offense to the professor, but I am the TA, so. But teaching with this book has been a real joy. Someone who came from a master's program in human rights, understand there's so many issues you have to touch on in a course, and then just getting to do so in a very digestible, user-friendly way. It's truly a pleasure, and I think the students really benefit from having a book like this one. I kind of wanted to raise maybe 2 points. One is just something that the book might be able to benefit from by adding, and then the other is more just like a contextual / additional lens to add to the book as well. One, on the first point, I would say is in terms of chapters to add, I think this tension pointed out by Professor Gelman is really important because there is sometimes this tendency to associate human rights with institutions or stick with the institutional lens, which I do not think this book does. But I do think that adding a chapter on human rights in practice or human rights movements in general might kind of widen the scope and connect the threads in the chapters. For instance, there are points in each chapter where they talk about different ways in which communities kind of got together to talk about human rights or advocate through a certain lens that don't follow the neat kind of institutional international law lens. However, bringing these back from like a macro perspective towards the end of maybe the next few chapters that are to be added would allow for students to maybe be a bit more inspired and kind of see how they can also insert themselves. Although this book is not only being written for students, I assume a big audience would be the classroom. And today we see that students make up the majority of political movements, human rights movements, marches, protests, and these are all aspects that human rights directly are implicated in. And I think it would really be just like a nice thread to kind of tie in that with the language that you're trying to teach the students about in this book. And hopefully that would be like one way to do so. So I think that might be my general suggestion. In terms of the contextual lens to look at though, I think some of these conversations in each of the chapters are directly related to each other. For example, chapter 3 and chapter 10, genocide and indigenous rights, are heavily implicated in each other. And if we're able to kind of spell out what some of these kind of lenses to look at from one particular sphere of human rights and how it might enrich another sphere, it can actually strengthen the book as well. For example, in chapter 10, we think of indigenous rights, but indigenous scholars have been talking about colonial genocide, specifically settler colonial genocide, and how cultural genocide has already occurred in their communities. And I think that there are points that point to this, especially in the introduction of the chapter, but getting to spell it out more thoroughly would actually help the students revisit chapter 3 when they're going through chapter 10, for instance, and make sure that they're on the same page of understanding. So hopefully that's a helpful critique, but also a welcome addition, invitation. But I really enjoy teaching with this book, so thank you.
Great. Do you want to respond to the discussant or this question? I'm sorry. I have one question online which would follow after you respond.
Thank you, Misha, for your wonderful and thoughtful comments. So it's really encouraging to see that you have read the book, and then I think we share a similar career path. So just thank you. And I specifically like your 3 critiques and citations in terms of updating some of the references. I think that would be certainly on the list for our to do this for new edition. And for children's rights and for Khmer Rouge, so those are the specific areas we can improve on. So that it's very, I would say thoughtful, really thoughtful, yeah. And for female genital cutting, in terms of the consistent use of the terminology, I think in one chapter we addressed the controversies surrounding the definition of the terminology used for this phenomena. And
I think we meant to use cutting, so we better check because obviously we were not being consistent. So that's helpful. We meant to use cutting. We were trying to avoid mutilation. So thank you for that. We will certainly fix that.
Yeah.
We really appreciate your reading it so carefully and you're such a leader in the field of human rights that you made time for this. We're so grateful. Thank you.
And for the new edition, some of the chapters, as you mentioned, immigration rights, and I do think this is an area that has attracted a lot of attention and also has significant real practical implications. So we will be certainly revisiting the necessity of including an independent chapter on immigration rights. If not, then I think this topic intersect with a lot of topics covered in this book. So we'll address the issue of immigration rights. And I think students in practice, I mean, you can find them interested in the topic as well.
I think we've learned from Therese Franklin, who's working on asylum jurisprudence, that there's a whole field of international refugee law. And so questions of people not being granted political asylum because of human rights issues, those sorts of questions tend not to be in human rights books. So I think Therese's research has made me aware that we need to find ways to integrate this into the book. So Therese knows this book too. I didn't know if she wanted to add something, but she is another human rights scholar and is working with Sharon. So I'm so lucky to work with such brilliant students at USC. And I love being here because of the students. You guys are amazing. And I just feel thrilled that I have had this chance in my life to work with people who are so imaginative and who are so oriented towards community service. And this is really an unusual place, USC, for all the scandals and other things. You guys make this place worthwhile.
And so you mentioned maybe we can add a more general discussion in a more summative way of how human rights defenders, how social movements have changed our society for the better, and how this could inspire future leaders and future generations to engage in social movements and more civic engagement. And yeah, so that would be a great idea.
Weren't you doing something like that at George Mason University?
Yes, and so well-being of human rights and social justice activists is one of the area I'm very interested in. And we have interviewed professional activists, volunteer activists, and student activists. So our book proposal on the well-being of college student activists is under review right now. But being able to talk to student activists always very inspiring to me. So we have interviewed over 127 college student activists, and their stories are amazing. So we can't wait to share their stories with the greater academic community. So and you mentioned maybe I could add something to the book as well. So,
I like the idea of doing social movements and putting that as a way to tie things together better. And your point about having more conversation between the chapters. Only risk with that is then it's harder for people just to use a chapter, but I guess we have to hope they're going to use the whole book. So I think you're right about that too. So thank you. Very thoughtful comments.
Okay, so we have two questions from the online audience. I would like to read them out side by side so that you can respond. So one comes from Dr. Wayne Sandholt, who is our professor of international relations at USC. So his question is, international human rights law seems to be in a vulnerable moment. Given the large-scale rights violations occurring in conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, and given the wide shift towards authoritarianism in many parts of the world, what should we tell students about the current moment and how to move forward in promoting rights? So that's the first question. Second question coming from Iliana Raggi. I'm not sure where the person's affiliation, but
She's a professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Cagliari in Sardinia.
Wonderful. So her question is, could you tell us some of the cross-cultural universals you found and in which area of human rights? So please.
Well, I think people should read our book. And the Geneva Conventions. I think Professor Sandholt's question is the question of the day, and it's very important, and there are many panels going on around campus, so I don't think that I can give due justice to the question, but I thank him for it. I don't think human rights are in a vulnerable moment. I know that historians like Samuel Moyne and Lynn Hunt at the school across town are a number of books questioning the foundations of human rights because Europeans played a major role. But even scholars who are part of post-colonial theory, third world approaches to international law, while they suggest that we revisit and reinterpret these standards, they don't want us to abandon human rights. So I would disagree with the premise that we're in a vulnerable moment. There are always difficulties with enforcement, but the human rights standards themselves are not vulnerable or in jeopardy. So I would disagree with the premise of the question. Professor Ruggio always asks the hardest questions. I have so enjoyed working with her. She's a major scholar in cultural rights herself. And my first book, when I was a graduate student, was about looking for cross-cultural universals. And the one that I wrote about then was the right against arbitrary killing. So Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights would be one. I think that certain things like the right to food is one that could be documented in terms of food sharing practices around the world. If you look at empirical evidence about what happens when there's a famine or some kind of natural disaster, there's a kind of customary norm that people share food. So they may not use the words right to food because they don't have the language of rights. They may express the moral obligation as a duty to share within a community. So it's very nice of Professor Ruggio to invite me to discuss my own theory about this, but so those are just a couple of examples. And I had hoped that in my career, some of the students I worked with might want to help do empirical research to document other shared principles, but that hasn't been the choice of, I prefer that students pick their own topics, but I think there are more cross-cultural universals to be identified than I have done. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, and I think I thank you for those thoughtful questions. And for the first question, and I actually think the world certainly is in a very vulnerable state. But I think this points to an increasing interest in human rights and the increasing need of human rights. And I have to share with you my teaching experiences since 2016. So the enrollment of my human rights class is skyrocketing. So for some probably obvious reasons, because students, they feel like, yeah, my human rights is in jeopardy, so I really need to care of my friends' rights. So and I have students from engineering school, from business school, so it's very surprising, and it's a little bit saddening to see why students, they are certainly interested in human rights is because of the world they're living in being vulnerable, right? So but on the other hand, there's also point to the obligation of us as human rights educators, how to make students see the relevance. They already feel the relevance, but how can we connect the dots for them, connect the gap between theory and practice. So for me, actually, in terms of teaching, it's a positive sign to see the growing demand of those courses. But as an individual who cares deeply about human rights, certainly you have seen the atrocities, you have seen gross human rights violations around the world. But that, for personally, that point to the necessity of everybody knowing, interested in, and protecting and promoting human rights.
Thank you. Maybe from the what? Yeah.
I think introduce this whole thing. Yes, my name is Alexander DeWine, and I'm a first year POI art student. And I really enjoyed working as a doing it. It's very important. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about some of those most sensitive topics, which you presented a little bit on, and how we can be maybe sensitive in our conversations with people from very different cultural backgrounds and things of this nature. So recently there was big news in Uganda with some of the LGBTQ laws that were passed. And I would love to dive into the chapter that speaks about these types of things. But I was wondering if you guys would speak a little bit about maybe the role of the state and what should be sort of how we can deal with different cultures and the ways in which they view some of these more sensitive topics from like a Western perspective, we might think are as universal, but from a very different perspectives they might see in a different way. Even things like women's rights or LGBTQ rights or those types of things, especially when you're interacting with people from those cultures, they might think very differently.
So I remember one time I was teaching FGC, so female genital cutting, and my goodness, among my students, there was one student, female student. She's from Ethiopia, and she shared her experience. Actually, her sister, her older sister, just went through the procedure. So I think that why kind of really opened my students' eyes, and those kind of intercultural dialogue and sharing of experience is extremely important. And LGBTQ rights for some students from Africa, it's still a taboo topic. But when you run into a new topic, there could be two different reactions. One is, oh, this is just so different, and then the other would be, wow, this is different. So I've seen both responses in my classroom, and but I think both responses essentially produce a healthy kind of an environment for this type of culture exchanges. And I do think, as Dr. Renteln mentioned, this kind of cross-cultural universals is based on dialogues, and we, particularly in this polarizing society, we really need to listen to each other and different cultures. And USC is one of the most diverse campus around the world. And the university I'm teaching, George Mason University, is also extremely diverse. So we are in an environment that is fruitful for bridging the gap and establishing some kind of a cross-cultural understanding of some very, very sensitive topics, including LGBTQ rights, including some of the women's rights topic.
I think when the question is, how should we be culturally sensitive when we deal with sensitive topics, or the more sensitive topics? It seems to me all the topics in human rights are sensitive topics. The ones you mentioned, but so are all of them. And I always feel as though I should probably give a trigger warning before every class. I forget sometimes, but really it's very difficult material, and you have to really have a rapport with your students before you can discuss anything. But I agree that if you have a student in the class who's from the country who volunteers to discuss something, you don't want to call on students if they don't want to discuss it. It's very important. I remember early on in my career, we were talking about the United States invasion of Panama. And the Americans were very sure that this was the correct thing. And there was a student from Panama in the class who had quite a different perspective. So I do agree that sometimes if you listen to people from other societies and you get a sense of the intercultural logic, not that everybody in the community will agree, but hearing different perspectives forces you to challenge your preconceived ideas. And that's why I worry a lot about universities now, thinking that we shouldn't deal with topics that make people uncomfortable. I don't really know how we can teach human rights if we have to avoid things that make people uncomfortable. It's only by coming to terms with things that are difficult that you gain insight. So I think that we have to be careful what words we use. I think language is very important, and trying to be careful to use the correct terms. Dr. Samantha Winch wrote a dissertation on language rights, and so language is very important to identity. But I think it's really paying attention to the inner cultural logic, because a cultural imperialism doesn't work. If you want to bring about social change, I think we share this view. You have to try to help people within the culture who are trying to bring about social change. And so trying to avoid forcing change or foisting new things on communities, and trying to empower the people who are trying to change things in these social movements. And maybe that could be part of this chapter that we have yet to write on social movements, is thinking about how to empower people who are parts of the world where it's very difficult for them to protest.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes to the end, but we have a wonderful new participant to this session, Dr. Christian Cortes, who is the Gender and Women Rights Advisor for the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has just joined us. I hope we can ask him to comment a little bit, on on the book, and maybe if there's any other follow-up questions, we will go there. But I just want to remind you that we have actually 5 copies of this wonderful book for raffles. So if you have not put your name in there, please take that red thing and put your name and email address and put it in, and then we will announce that raffle at the end. Thank you, Dr. Curtis.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
So thanks a lot for the invitation. I had the opportunity to give a shot to the book before it was published and send some comments too. So first, I wanted to make 3 points. The first is praising the book. I think it's an excellent book on many accounts. I will mention some. One is the breadth of the issues it covers. It really delivers on the promise of a very thorough and complete survey. So it's encompassing many issues, and that breaks a little bit. I'll speak a bit more about this afterwards. But the tradition of some U.S. casebooks that mostly focus on civil and political rights issues, this goes far beyond that, and I think it's a very representative survey of the wealth of issues that are encompassed by international human rights law. Second, it's not only thematically thorough, but it's also thorough in terms of covering both the universal human rights system and regional human rights system. It's impossible to cover all the issues in all systems, but it gives a good sense of the parallel developments and in some cases the cross-fertilization of different systems. I'm happy to see the book reflects part of the evolution of the inter-American human rights system, for example, that might be interesting for readers in the Americas, but also to English-speaking readers that are not that familiar with regional human rights systems and development thereby. A third point is it's a very reader-friendly book, which is not a traditional virtue in law books or law-oriented books. So I think it's an excellent material for a span of different readers, and it also goes a little beyond the typical jargon of lawyerly approaches to human rights. It includes different interdisciplinary perspectives, including philosophical, anthropological perspectives. So I think that expands the span of readers it may have. It's not only lawyers or practicing lawyers or academics, but I think the audience is broader. And I think that's a very good recipe against one of the curses of these books, which is the fast outdating. Many of the probably by now, many of the materials are already outdated because there's new materials that have appeared in the last year. And I think one of the possible responses to that is there's a philosophical and anthropological backing of the issues. So the materials can be seen as examples, but it doesn't need to claim that they are the last word on the issue, and the way in which the issues are posed elicit interesting discussions that go beyond the fact that there might be new materials to renew the book. So you don't need to run against the clock on updating it with materials because that's an impossible task. The second point I wanted to make is, compared to many traditional case books or manuals on international human rights published in the US or with a US perspective, or that were mainly meant for US law school public, which generally, I can't say university, but generally had a very US perspective on human rights, and that might include two issues. One is the fact that they were mainly centered on civil and political rights, which resonate to the negative rights tradition of the constitutional law in the US. So this book actually has a much broader perspective and captures much better discussions that include many other fields: economic, social, and cultural rights, rights of indigenous peoples, environmental rights and international human rights law, and the rights of different groups, women, persons with disabilities, the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity, and human rights. So on that account, I haven't seen any book that covers so many different issues, and I think it doesn't sacrifice rigor, but it combines good synthesis, because I mean, it's a long book, but it covers many different issues with a rigorous take, and I think it gives a good overview of the development of different areas of international human rights law. I mean, I went deep into the chapters of the areas I work on, mainly economic, social, and cultural rights, some minorities, some group rights like rights of persons with disabilities, also indigenous and environmental rights. I mean, I would say it's a fair picture of recent developments on these areas, even if there's always some new things that we're discussing these days with the different special rapporteurs that have environmental mandates. And since last year's recognition of the right to a healthy environment by the GA, there have been a number of interesting evolutions that would also make complement part of the take of the book. But I think it offers an updated and good overview of the evolution in these different areas. Perhaps one area that you didn't tackle was the discussion, which is a very politicized discussion, on the right to development as a human right. This is perhaps an area you didn't choose to. It's a one that looks more like a collective right and has had less of applications, judicial applications in domestic or international courts. I mean, there are some examples, but that's a heated area of debate. Of course, you cannot cover every possible thing under the earth, but that's an issue that usually polarizes Western and global North and global South countries, and might be an issue to pay attention if one is interested in the evolution of international law and on how different takes on the issue use the language of human rights in a different framing. So this is a collective framing that underscores differential duties from developed and developing countries, include the idea that there's a right to enjoy human rights and that the whole international community should participate in that. But I think that's one of the only issues that has not been addressed. And if we want to offer a thorough overview of recent discussions on international human rights law. And the third one, the third point I would make is, in principle, one of the things that these books are geared to courses that deal with international human rights law. That's a very narrow area in legal education in U.S. law schools, because they basically cater for the lawyers that are interested in joining international human rights law, which usually has to do with either international organizations or with international human rights NGOs that work on that. Many U.S. law schools play an important function in litigation overseas by helping litigation before different courts or bringing cases or participating in shadow reporting, etc. But their gear is usually human rights, means human rights beyond the US, abroad, not human rights in the US. And that's kind of the way in which the area has been framed. But my point here is, this is a book that would also be interesting for readers of American domestic constitutional law, because the conceptions that are offered here actually speak about many things that were born in the US or developed in the US or co-developed in the US. And some examples are intersectionality, the whole law of anti-discrimination law, the idea of indirect discrimination, concepts that ground international human rights law on the persons with disabilities, such as the ideas of accessibility and reasonable accommodation. Many of these ideas were born in the US or were mainly developed in the US, or the US domestic law was a strong contributor to these ideas, but were exported to some degree outside the US and actually made their way in a way which is completely different from the conservative turn that the US federal courts took from the 90s on. So for foreign readers, the US Supreme Court decisions were traditionally an interesting aspect for discussion. Now it probably that bright period of discussion has been very shadowed by this conservative turn, and many of the things that are either dead or in a state of coma in the discussion of the US Supreme Court have had a very different life in international human rights courts, regional and in treaty bodies in Geneva. So sometimes comparing what happened with some ideas like indirect discrimination or the whole issue of discrimination law, or how the whole issue of economic, social, and cultural rights that have little tradition at the federal level in the US and might have some tradition at the state level only for the right to education, but very little. But the whole discussion on how positive obligations can be either discussed, adjudicated upon, and elicit judicial decisions. What are the ways of measuring? What are the legal safeguards or guarantees to measure progressive realization, etc. Many of these ideas have little space in the discussion in domestic US law, and I think a comparative view of how this has played out in international law might bring practitioners in the US a good idea of, some of the unfulfilled promises of constitutional law in the US and the way in which the same ideas actually expanded much more than their origin in US law. So I'm sorry, I took some more time, but that was my last point. So thanks for your patience.
Thank you for your comments. I was hoping that you were going to say what you wrote to us, which was you thought the book should be used by people who are joining international organizations. But that's very interesting what you say about using it in courses on civil rights and civil liberties, which I teach here. And I usually require the students to write a paper that compares one US constitutional issue with something in another country. And Chris was here earlier, and we worked together in that class last time. So that's very interesting. Maybe Cambridge will think about marketing the book to people who teach those courses. Certainly, they could at least use the chapters that relate to some of the topics they're covering. So thank you very much for making time to join us. Your comments are very helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Curtis. So we are out of time. If you want, last few words from the authors, just thank you everybody for coming and
thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you. It was fun.